On today's episode of Cornell Keynotes, we examine the European Union's ambitious vision to become the world's AI continent. We are joined by Cornell professor Lutz and special guest Lucilla Sioli, who's director of the European Commission's AI office. Together, the two unpack the groundbreaking AI Continent Action Plan, which you'll hear more about shortly. Lucilla and Lutz explore Europe's big AI strategy, and this goes from establishing AI factories and secure data spaces to building an ecosystem that balances innovation with democratic values, all the while examining how the continent aims to position itself as a leader in the global AI economy. So be sure to check out the episode notes for links to the complete AI Continent Action Plan and related eCornell courses on AI strategy and implementation. Now, here's our discussion with Lutz and Lucilla Sioli.
Before we dig into this, let's talk a little bit about Europe as a whole. If we look from the US, we know where Europe is, obviously, but the question is, what is the European advantage in terms of AI? Is there a European advantage in terms of AI? How is Europe positioned in that race? It's a global race. We see it, China, US, India, and Europe. How is Europe positioned?
I think Europe is not badly positioned because Europe has some strengths that characterize it. For example, it has a lot of talent. There are more engineers per capita in the European Union than there are in the United States or in China. Europe has a very big and large and rich single market. It's not as integrated as it is in the United States, for example, because the European Union is not a federal union. It's a group of countries, of 27 countries that want to cooperate closely, and they have established a single market where we have, freedoms of movement, of trade, and of capital. But it is a single market, and it is large. It's bigger, if you want, than the United States. There are more people in the European Union than in the United States. And it's particularly rich on average. Europe is also very strong from the point of view of research. Number of publications is very, very high. We have excellent universities. And so on average, European population is very well educated and therefore likely to uptake technology.
Nice. So it's essentially good engineering talent, strong research, and a big market. There is an interesting fact to it, through large language models, a large language model, or an embedding, how we call it, it takes information and embeds it in a computer language kind of thing. Let's keep it that high level. But that means that all those large language models are multilingual by definition, right? For my startup, if I'm do sales advice for one of the companies, it doesn't make a difference whether they talk in Italian, German, or English to my model. My model automatically knows those languages, meaning Europe actually has a way, is a big market. So far, there was always a problem of multilingual, and that is actually breaking down with the current technology.
Certainly, the technology is one element that will help in making the continent more homogeneous. Of course, there are also some differences between countries. I'm thinking, for example, employment legislation, capitals that are not yet flowing between countries exactly as we would expect them to do yet. But we are working on these aspects. And so we are trying to make the continent much smoother in terms of the single market than it is now. But then there is another couple of elements, I think, that are unique for AI to the European Union. One is the fact that there are many developments that are brought forward by startups and scale-ups, and they tend to be very strong at B2B. So you will not see in the European Union many models for consumers. As you see, for example, the United States, also in the United States, you already have social media, all these platform, and that work very much for consumers models. In the European Union, it tends to be more for businesses. And secondly, we have some kind of infrastructure, which is probably unique for AI, because we have a network of public supercomputers. And these are very advanced supercomputers. We are even upgrading them now, even more with more GPUs and so to AI capabilities. And this is a public network, meaning that universities, startups, companies can use these networks. And that should facilitate over time more developments, because the computing resources are made available basically for free, at least to the startups and to the universities. Companies, bigger companies will have to pay for it, but everybody else can access it for free.
Which is a super fascinating discussion, because we saw early on VC companies actually acquiring infrastructure like NVIDIA A100 chips, and then offering this as a capacity to scale-ups and startups, to saying, well, we don't invest in you, but we do invest in you, but what we really do is we give you access to an infrastructure that would have been otherwise scarce. And that model seemed to have worked. Now, I saw that the EU, under the idea of the AI continent, actually focused a lot on this infrastructure play, which is it's an interesting discussion to have, because the question is how much infrastructure is needed for a company to scale up, right? It's definitely an interesting discussion for research. If you think about large models, transformer models, developing new drugs, or building out new foundation models. But some companies we saw, like OpenAI was now late with their number 5, right? So the progression of investment actually went down. I personally kind of made a lot of jokes about Stargate that got announced, and saying, yes, there's a lot of investment, this is cool, but do we really need that? How does the EU think about this investment area? How much can we really gain from having a network of supercomputers for research? No question, but for developing an ecosystem of a thriving economy, essentially.
Well, for the startups and the scale-ups, having access to computing resources for free is very, very important.
Yes.
I mean, even American companies who are very strong in AI, like the one you mentioned, was supported in terms of computing resources initially by another company. And that is all fine. So here, what we are trying to do is to give these startups and the scale-ups the possibility to have computing resources for free. Now, it's true that the bigger and the more advanced these models are, and the more reasoning they will have, they will need more GPUs. And now it's good also that NVIDIA is producing the Blackwell, which are more efficient. So maybe you don't need many more in terms of numbers, but you still need to have more computing capacity as we go on. And in fact, in the AI Continent Action Plan, on the one hand, we say, look, we are now upgrading our supercomputers to more AI capabilities through the AI factories, but we are also planning to set up a limited number of what we call gigafactories, which are very, very strong supercomputers integrated with data centers. And if one needs to train a very advanced frontier model right now, we need to have this kind of computing infrastructure. So I do not know if Stargate is too much, or the plans exactly and what will happen, we will see. But obviously, if you want to train a model with more than trillions of parameters, you do need to have a very, very powerful supercomputer. And that's what we call the gigafactory in the European Union as well.
Yes. You said something earlier where you talked about the strong B2B landscape in Europe. And that's true, right? Now, as we saw in other technology revolutions, the mobile revolution, for example, it was the companies who had access to data and to customers who gained most of the benefits. So there is a good argument to be made that Europe is actually extremely well positioned with their setup, with their companies in order to reap the benefits. Is there anything from your side as a policymaker, something you kind of want to stress or want to put together to enable the existing company landscape to be most effective?
Well, on the one hand, we need to make sure that companies have access to the best infrastructure. In the US, all these developments are driven by platforms who do have computing capacity. Think of the cloud capacity that you have in the United States. They have the data. So they have what is needed to bring forward the data revolution. In the European Union, because these developments are driven by startups and scale-ups, it's important, on the one hand, that the policies make available this infrastructure as much as possible to these companies. So computing capacity, we spoke about it, but also data. You need high quality data and a lot of data to train these models. So what we are trying to do in the European Union, for example, is to make sure that we have what we call European data spaces with high quality data sets. And we have mechanisms also for companies to pull data in competitive ways if there is a need for training models that need data coming from different sources. So we are linking then these data spaces to the supercomputers, and we are creating what I called earlier AI factories, which will also provide services in terms of training, for example.
Is it fair to say, just to jump in there, is it fair to say, so essentially Europe has not an established ecosystem as the US? Like in the US, you have big players, they're creating an ecosystem, they are offering resources, they're offering access. And the way you think about it as a policymaker is that you're saying, in order for us to be competitive, we're trying to provide now the infrastructure as well as the space for data sharing to happen.
Yeah, this is exactly. So we are trying to provide the necessary infrastructure, computing capacity, and data for companies to facilitate their development in AI. And then there is another element of infrastructure. I call it an element of infrastructure, which is skills and talent. So we also support, more master courses, more PhDs in AI, in particular, to make sure that we have enough talent in the European Union for this kind of developments.
Awesome.
But then, once the models are developed, we also want companies and our key industrial sectors to use them, because this is, if you want, the comparative advantage in the European Union has always been traditional sectors like manufacturing, automotive, aerospace, and so on. So we want these sectors to make use of AI to make sure that also these sectors remain competitive and drive innovation. Because innovation is not only the development of AI, innovation is also the use of AI by other industrial sectors or service sectors. And so what we try to do with our policies is to facilitate what we call the application of AI. We call it the apply AI approach or the apply AI strategy, whereby we try to facilitate the adoption of AI by all these key sectors of our economy. And we need to facilitate that, probably because our ecosystem is a bit less integrated than it is in the United States. So we have to make sure that companies in these key sectors are actually making use of AI, and if possible, AI made in the European Union.
Got it. AI made in the European EU. This is a nice new slogan here. So I think there is a three-pronged approach, if I follow you correctly, right? Like enable infrastructure, enable data access, and train to enable companies actually to use AI more effectively. And all together should create a vibrant ecosystem, which in the past, like Europe, as you said, like has many engineers, and Europe has done a lot of cool research. But in the past, I think it's fair to say that the past technology revolution have scaled up in the US and not in Europe. So you're trying to create a system to actually enable the system. If you go to the data spaces, AI is built out of data. The data is then ingrained in weights and biases, right? This is the model weights, and those create a competitive advantage. If you would go to Google or Amazon or OpenAI or any of them, all Mistral, and saying, give us all the weights, they would be not as happy, except they do an open source model. If we create data spaces, how is that creating a competitive advantage? Because essentially, if you have a space where everybody shares their data, then there is no competitive advantage for the companies to gain. How does the EU thinks about that in a regulatory framework?
Well, data spaces are not only about publicly available data sets. They're also about ways of sharing data. We have legislation on the way companies can share data with each other. It's called the Data Act. You may have heard of it. And it's about facilitating the sharing of data between companies. And so what the data spaces do when it comes to business data, for example, is to give ways or to offer ways and examples of facilitating the share of data, maybe along the supply chain of, for example, manufacturing rather than something else. So they're not necessarily about having data or data sets that people can actually use. So, of course, the public data sets are open to everyone. I think we have some important ones. I think, for example, the Copernicus data sets are also used by many American companies in terms of Earth observation kind of data. But other data spaces are then subject also to certain regulations. We are setting up the health data space with its own regulation and so on. And so it is very much about facilitating an exchange of data also between European organizations and actors and being subject to certain kind of data regulation.
I like this a lot because when we compare, like if we look at the US industry, right, it's dominated by players who have access to data, right? And we see this actually in the current AI discussion. The ones who have access to data are way better positioned in this part of the revolution. So by you guys creating a way to share data, you might actually leapfrog the approach between, like, you don't need to have a huge conglomerate with all the data, because smaller companies together can create the same value creation like somebody who would own all the data in one go.
Yeah, and then I think what is also going to be important in the future is that we also will support the development and the production of more synthetic data. I think this is going to be extremely important for the world of AI because, you know, everybody's scraping the internet. At one point, the internet is scraped, and you just need to find more data. You will have to rely a lot on synthetic data. So I think that both in the United States and the European Union, there will be a lot of attention to the development of synthetic data.
Yes, totally. And we see this already happening, right? Like a lot of companies. It's a tricky balance, by the way, because synthetic data should contain the tiny clues the model wants to learn. So we need to know what tiny clues we want to train. Yeah. Very often we see this in privacy constrained areas like healthcare. But I expect way more to actually happening in the whole area of image generation. We see a lot of synthetic data companies coming up at the moment. So let's talk about trustworthy AI. So far, we talked about the ecosystem, right? You described there are several approaches. You as a EU regulator, or like I called you earlier on the spokesperson for the Scales Up. You as a spokesperson for the Scales Up are putting together access to infra, better way of sharing data, as well as helping with education and making use of the talent that is there in Europe. Now, in the last announcement on the AI continent, you talked a lot about trustworthy AI. And from my point of view, it's a double-edged sword, right? If you say trustworthy AI, who decides what is trustworthy and how big is the hurdle you need to jump over to be actually trustworthy? Talk me through this. What does it mean to be trustworthy AI? And maybe before you do this, just an acknowledgement to the audience, guys. There is no 100% in humans and there is no 100% in AI, meaning AI, like humans, has always a percentage where it's wrong, right? It's the same approach, whether it's human brain or an AI brain. So, but like, talk to me about trustworthiness.
Trustworthiness is about making sure that the AI we use is a system or a technology that one can trust. And the reason why there are situations where one cannot trust it, it's because AI is, of course, trained on data. And there are contexts where we don't just want to have an AI which exacerbates the biases we may have developed historically. I'll give you an example. If I'm a company, I'm looking for an engineer, and I do that, for example, on LinkedIn or in any other, through any other application or for hiring human resources, then if the AI that is looking at the CVs and that is offering me the profiles that are found on the market is only trained on past data, is likely to just give me, in the European Union, white male engineers. Because this is what we have in the majority of engineering positions at the moment. But of course, nowadays, with the new generation, there are more women, of course, on the market, only that the AI will probably think that in the past I've been hiring a lot of male engineers, and therefore it will give me a CV of a male engineer. So I think it's important that for certain kind of applications where discrimination, for example, is important, certain characteristics are kept in check. So this is one example.
And it's a very good example. And by the way, in my course, the public eCornell course where I talk about models, I use this very example as a biased one, right? Because it's easy to see. Now the question, so meaning if an AI selects candidates, and as you said, it was trained on biased data, then it will select biases, right? So the AI just reflects the data it was trained on. And if the data is biased, the AI is biased. It's always the data. So now, but the question for me is what is trustworthy? So let's keep that example of the hiring. At the moment, and those numbers are totally made up. So don't, I just made the numbers up. So let's say in the EU, 70% of the engineers are men and 30% are women, right? What is a trustworthy AI? Because it should be 50-50, right? Is a trustworthy AI an AI which does 50, like gets you 50 women and 50 men? Or is a trustworthy AI which is 70-30? Or is a trustworthy AI which selects the best talent for the job, meaning the highest success ratio? What is trustworthy in this case? And why is the EU deciding this and not the company who's building the model?
Well, I think that a trustworthy AI would be an AI that does not consider gender as a relevant factor for the choice, but is based on the capabilities reflected in people's CVs. Now, we think that it's important that for certain applications where, this kind of discrimination can really have a negative impact on our society, these things are kept in check. And what we are asking with our regulation is that companies that put on the market this kind of AI first check that the bias. We also ask them to document how they have developed the system. And we also ask them to provide information to the user on these kind of elements and whether the user has to be attentive to anything in particular. So sometimes I think this is what any serious data scientist developing an AI for a field which is likely to show, like in this case, discrimination should do. A serious data scientist would be documenting what she or he is doing. And it's in this sense that I don't think that the AI Act is particularly burdensome, because it is asking simply to document before the AI is put on the market. And this requirement is only limited to certain applications. We spoke about the recruitment case. Other examples are, for example, for universities, when they use AI to select the students that may have access to the university. In the European Union, we had incidents where the universities would base their selection on the schools where the students come, the high schools, basically, where the students come from. And the high schools based in richer areas tend to have a higher number of students normally going to university. And therefore, it would have been, this kind of AI would be really discriminatory towards those maybe less well-off students that have studied in areas or in schools where maybe less students normally go to university. So we find that this is another example of a discriminatory AI. We had incidents like this in the European Union, and so we have decided also, for example, the AI that is used in universities in this sense to be considered high risk. And we have done the same for when the AI is used in healthcare, for example, and then for the AI systems that may have an impact on safety.
This makes all sense. And then we have technically, and I don't go into technical details here, but like come to the course if you want to know more. There are many things how we can actually manage bias. But the fact is, all data is biased, right? And no model is unbiased. Like essentially, we want a model to figure out tiny clues. If we like those tiny clues, we say tiny clues and we say the model is good. If we don't like the tiny clues because they actually point to something which we didn't intend to see, then we say it's biased, right? But it's the same mathematical impact here. Now, the question comes down for me to who decides that threshold and who decides what to focus on, right? Let's take self-driving cars. Self-driving cars are going to be awesome. They're going to be in the market. I'm living in San Francisco. We have them on the street. There seem to be more self-driving cars by now than normal cars. And they will come. They will come as well into Europe. But self-driving cars make mistakes. They are not infallible, right? So we will have situations where self-driving cars will kill people. That means a robot kills a human. What level is accepted versus not? This is an error rate. Bias is an error, right? Bias is an unwanted error, which you might reduce, but what is acceptable and was not acceptable? And why is the EU deciding this? Because it's a safety issue, but how do you come to the conclusion?
Well, the error rate or the accuracy will be decided in standards, which are not decided by the EU or by us. It's decided by industry normally, working on these standards. So, as I said, the AI Act only addresses a very limited number of applications, and so we will be requiring that for those applications there are accuracy rates that are decided by industry that work and participate in the standardization organizations. So just to say that you're right, there will never be an AI that is infallible. And so our system of ex-ante checking, if you want, is about minimizing the risk of accidents once the AI is in the market. Accidents can still happen. And then in that case, there will be authorities that will intervene, that will look at the accident, but they will simply conclude that if they can see that the developer or the deployer of that AI system has done its homework in terms of making sure that the system is minimizes bias, the documentation is there, the information given to the user is correct, then there will be no consequences.
Got it.
It's a mechanism to minimize the risk that an accident happens. You cannot avoid it completely.
Got it. There are two questions now in my mind. Minimizing risk First of all, is the risk level, depending on where you as a regulator put your focus, as well as once a risk happened, what happens to the company. Let's do them in two different steps. So if you want to minimize risk and you compare now another country outside of the EU versus the EU, the other country is more relaxed with the risk. So it doesn't apply the same minimization needs, meaning like, okay, yeah, you launch it, maybe something goes wrong, we will improve later, versus the EU, which says, okay, I have a certain risk standard. And like as essentially, how much do you focus on innovation versus how much do you focus on risk avoidance? These are, in my mind at least, two areas which are a trade-off. How does the EU deal with it? And what does it mean for the ecosystem, which you described earlier on, you're trying to support?
Well, as I said, the EU is looking at risk and probably setting a higher standard than maybe other parts of the world. Although, let's admit it, there are regulations on AI also in other countries, not only in the European Union nowadays. And it looks at risk and it may set a higher bar than in other parts of the world, but only for some applications of AI, not for the whole market. I would say it's probably targets, 10% of the market. And that's very important. And the other important element is that it does that across the European Union. So it's one set of rules across the European Union. Recently, I was reading the AI Stanford Index, which was indicating that in the United States, there are many, many different pieces of legislation on AI in different states. So a developer who wants to sell in the United States probably has to be careful in each state to meet the requirement of the relevant legislation. While in the European Union, the idea is if you're developing an AI that may be considered to be high risk, and you need to put in place certain checks before you put this on the market, you do this once, and you do this in any country of the European Union you want, and after that, this AI can circulate freely in the European market. So this is very important also to keep in mind.
So while there's a trade-off, and I totally get it, there is a trade-off. However, the value you actually see here is that it's at least a standardized trade-off across all different countries. Can you, like, you are in the field, you're talking to scale-up and startups. What's their reaction to the AI Act? What do you hear from European companies back to you?
I have a mixed reaction in the sense that there are some companies who think, some startups who think that the rules may be burdensome, but I can tell you that the majority of the startups I talk to, they totally get it, and they see it as an advantage. They see that the AI they sell, they can refer to it as being trustworthy because it's compliant with the AI Act, and in this way, they find it much more easy to sell. We live in a world where the media talks very negatively about AI, and AI is gonna kill everyone and is gonna take over the world. And the fact that people can actually, and organizations and business users that can actually trust that technology, they consider this an advantage. So the trustworthiness of the technology can be used as a branding, a commercial branding, and therefore can be turned into an advantage.
Awesome, thanks. This is actually an interesting one. We're living in a world where AI is seen as something dangerous. That depends on where you look. Like if you look in Silicon Valley, then obviously people are way more positive about all the value that can be created with AI. I personally have said many times, I don't believe in AGI kind of ruling the world. And that's technically, in my view, still a lot of BS. Moreover, it is still us humans who have agencies. And so let's move into the last part where we kind of think a little bit about how do you change perception for AI? How do you enable people to be trained to build, to actually create the AI continent? Because all what you can do as a regulator is you set the rules. You kind of set the ability for people then to create amazing things.
Well, our main message has always been that artificial intelligence is good for the world, is good for the European Union, is good for everybody. So our main objective is to stimulate the development and the use of AI across the European Union. And that's why we put in place all the actions that you can find in the AI continent strategy. We want developments in the European Union in terms of AI. We want to have more technological sovereignty. So we want to be able to make these developments in the European Union and not just depend on other parts of the world. And we want to use it. But to use it again, we need to create trust, because there is sometimes lack of trust towards this technology, exactly because it's a black box and you don't know how it's going to behave. And we need to have people understand that AI is actually a positive technology and use it with more, let's say, friendliness than is suggested in the news very often. And that's why I think at the end of the day that even a very targeted piece of legislation can be useful to support investment, but alone it cannot do much. And that's why we also have to support our infrastructure, our talent, and the adoption of AI in general in the European Union. This is going to be key in the next few years to come.
Got it. No, this makes sense. Now, what would you tell to people like me? So, like I told you my story before, right? I tried to come back to Europe a few times. I'm an AI guy. I realized that I couldn't really build like a lot of products. There was a lag. I have now my own startup. My advisory board tells me, look into the US, don't look into Europe, despite being a lot of Europeans on the advisory board. What do you tell innovators and people who build stuff like me?
Well, I would tell you to come to Europe now. Now it's the time, because we are really trying to build this AI continent. So not only you will find the infrastructure that you need, and this infrastructure will be made available to you for free, but also you will find the talent you need. And we are setting up certain elements to facilitate the life of startups. So for example, we are strengthening what we call the capital union, so the possibility to have much more venture capital and more equity than it has ever been possible in the past. And we are also simply facilitating the life of the startups and the scale-ups. We will be publishing a strategy pretty soon to put in place what we call the 28th regime. So a regime only for the startups and the scale-ups to facilitate their growth in the single market, basically smoothing the differences between countries in some of the administrative activities that companies have to put in place when they are active in different countries. So I think the moment really is now. And I really hope that the brilliant minds of Europeans all over the world really come back to Europe, because we need them. And we would love to work with them, of course.
Thank you for listening to Cornell Keynotes. Now be sure to check out the episode notes for more information about eCornell's AI, technology, and innovation certificate programs. I want to thank you for listening, friends, and please subscribe to stay in touch.